Welcome to engine repair, or automotive engine repair. Here's our project for this semester where we're going to be rebuilding this engine, or I guess I will, and you'll watch me and hopefully learn from it. This is a 5.3 liter GM engine. I believe it's called I don't remember the number. Everybody calls them LS's. It's out of a 2005 GMC 1500, and it's an iron block with aluminum cylinder heads. So we're going to be rebuilding this throughout the course, doing disassembly in this first series of videos, and then we'll transition over into inspection, measurements, and machining. From there, we're going to decide on which parts we're going to order. We're going to order parts and when they come in. We'll do parts inspections, and then the final machining, and then cleaning, and then reassembly, and we'll finish up with testing. We'll actually run this thing on what's called a sim tester, which will actually drive the engine so that we can measure its compression and measure its oil pressure to see if there's any excessive or insufficient oil pressure. So the first thing I'd like to do is grab the camera and bring you over here, and we're going to take a look at this engine. Now, I got this engine from a friend of mine who owns and operates a salvage yard, and this one was actually sitting upside down in a detached truck bed, and it's a core. So a core is an engine that you can purchase that is not in running condition necessarily. It may, but it's more than likely not going to run very well. But a core is a rebuildable engine. So as a core, we can purchase this engine for about $150, sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on the model. And this engine will be guaranteed to be rebuildable. And what that guarantee means is that there's not going to be any holes in the side of the block from a connecting rod poking through it. There's not going to be any broken cylinders from a connecting rod or piston coming apart. There's not going to be any cracks in the cylinder heads. So whoever sells cores, if you do find that, when you find that, say, there's an irreparable damage to components that are normally reused, you call them and tell them, say, hey, this block is no good, and they'll usually just do an exchange on the long block or the short block or the cylinder head cores that you purchased. So the first thing I want to do is do a quick walk around on this engine so that we can get an idea of what it looks like. All right, so here's our 5.3. You can see it's actually got aluminum heads. So these are the aluminum heads, and then this is a cast iron block right here. The front of the engine, we have our harmonic dampener. So this guy right here, which is called the crankshaft pulley or the harmonic dampener. So what that means is harmonic dampener means this actually dampens vibrations created by the crankshaft. Now the crankshaft doesn't actually spin nice and smoothly, it actually pulsates. And on this engine, every 45 degrees, it's going to get a power pulse. And this inner ring right here is attached to these spokes, which are actually bolted to the crankshaft. And then this outer ring is actually supported by a vulcanized rubber ring. So this inner metal ring and this outer metal ring are connected via a rubber band, basically. So this inner one will accelerate, and then this one in the end, or on the outside, will actually more slowly accelerate, hopefully, smoothing out the pulses. There's our crankshaft pulley bolt, and that's usually a pretty large bolt, and it gets pretty tight. We have our front cover. Coming over to the other side, we see our valve covers here. Down in the middle, they call this the valley cover. And this is actually going to be sealing off the center of the engine, and it's a PCV cover. In the back of the engine, on this one, we actually have a camshaft position sensor. Down in the back, you notice this is our rear cover in the back of the engine. So the rear of the crankshaft is down there. This is the rear of the crank, and that's where the flex plate or the flywheel is going to bolt to. Coming over the other side, we see we've got our other head. And then coming down to the end, or the front of the engine, we see that we have a bit of an issue. So we see that this valve cover is actually damaged. It's been broken and it's cracked. So this valve cover is not reusable. But a core only guarantees the cylinder head, the block, the crankshaft. Those pieces are reusable. Not the valve covers, not the valley pan, and nothing else. Now this one does have a remnant from the vehicle, and it's the AC compressor bracket. But that was just a bonus. It's just going to go into the scrap pile. Down across the bottom of the engine, you see we've got the oil pan. And the oil pan is kind of gross, but we're going to clean this thing up. It's going to look brand new. Down on the side of the block here, and we're just doing a quick inspection to see if there's anything that we notice that's wrong. So if we look at the block or the side of the cylinder head, we see that of these 4 exhaust ports, we've got the 1, 2, 3, and 4. This one has really got a lot of carbon buildup around it. And if we take a good close look at it, if I can zoom in, you can actually see something inside the hole. There's a broken off bolt there, and there's a broken off bolt right there. Okay, so that broken bolt and that broken bolt, still part of the core. It's not guaranteed it's not going to have broken bolts. And if we look here on the end, we also see that there's another one right there at the end of the cylinder head on the last exhaust manifold bolt hole that's got one in it also. So let's check the other side. So we know we have 3 broken bolts. And on this side here, I didn't fail to deliver. We've actually got another broken bolt right here. So we know we've got to remove 4 broken bolts. This is pretty common on these GM LS engines, and it's also very common on the Dodge trucks, the Hemis, and the 4.7s, and it's also very common on the Fords. As far as Toyota and Nissan, I have no idea. But Ford, Dodge, and Chevy, it happens in the pickup trucks, and we can't get away from it. Okay, so we see how this engine is actually mounted to the stand. And if we try to look at the center line, what a lot of people do is, what they try to do is they take that engine and they mount it as high as they can because they're more worried about their height. The problem with that is center of gravity. Notice our engine stand is going to rotate here. Our crankshaft is down below the center line of that because a majority of the weight of the engine is actually above the crankshaft. So what we want to do is try to get the center of the gravity of the engine as close to the rotating point on the engine stand. That'll make it, 1, easier, and 2, safer to rotate this engine around as we disassemble and reassemble it. So, all right, so let me get you remounted, and we're going to start disassembly on this engine with all the covers and get them off and inspect them. Okay, so let's begin disassembly. So the first thing we're going to be doing is removing the valve covers. Now on these here is just a series of 8mm bolts that go down through the center. Some engines will have very few, and some engines will have a lot of valve cover bolts. Now it should go without saying that bolts are very important, and we need to make sure that they go back into the same spot, in the correct spot. Now these bolts are actually captured by the valve cover, so they're not going to fall out. Now they are serviceable, because if we look at these valve cover bolts, if we were to pull this thing out, we see that it's actually got a sleeve on it, and that sleeve also has a grommet. This grommet is replaceable, and it's going to be replaced during our rebuild. So let's go ahead and put this down, or throw it down. So we got the other side. We have, I do notice that we've got 1 valve cover bolt missing. So we want to make sure it's not broken off in there. Looks like somebody might have just taken it off. We'll set that one down there. And then next thing I want to do is remove we have 2 sensors. We've got a sensor, our knock sensors that are mounted up here in the valley, and then we have the crank sensor, or the cam sensor that I pointed out earlier. So the first thing, I like to pull out the cam sensor. Now on this one, the cam sensor is a bit long, so you do need to be careful removing it if you're going to reuse it. So I'm going to use a pry bar just real simply and just get underneath it and wiggle it, and just until it comes all the way out. Now, this is not a good sign, but it's not the end of the world. So notice on this cam sensor, it's got some rust inside here. Now that is above the sealing O-ring, but that rust could mean that this engine has had water in it. Okay, so we'll put that there. The next thing I want to pull off are the knock sensors. Now, if you're replacing or rebuilding an engine and it's got knock sensors, it's actually best not to use an impact on them because you might hurt the mechanism on the inside. Now we can tell that these guys sat in water because we can see this one here on the right, or sorry, on the left there. It's actually got quite a bit of rust on it, so these two here would definitely go in the trash, and we don't want to try to reuse them. Now, a lot of people forget to take off the knock sensors on these LS engines, and they just start prying on them, and what will end up happening is actually pull the seal out of the bottom of the lifter tray here. So we're going to remove these bolts here. There we go. Again, making sure we don't mix the bolts up. Okay, so we take these bolts out. I'm going to throw them in my tray there. I'm going to get my pry bar again and try and find a spot where I can pry, and I need to carefully pry because I don't want to damage this cover because we do need to reuse it in this case here. Don't want to come up, it's rusted down. There we go. Starting to make some headway. Now it does have some gaskets on the bottom of these holes, and you're probably going to see just how crusty they are once I get it over to the table. There we go. Oh, one gasket stayed. So we see just how crusty these are. I don't know if you can see down inside that hole there, but it's actually pretty corroded. And on these engines here, it's actually pretty common for them to actually be corroded all the way through. So we've got the center cover, or the valley cover off, and this is the gasket. That's definitely just going to be trash. Then we're going to go on to the rear cover. Now the rear cover, I've already taken the bolts off of, and because before you mount it up on the engine stand, it's best to do that. Before I do anything, sorry about that noise. So what I'm going to do is roll this engine over so that you can see the bottom of the oil pan. If there's any water or oil, hopefully I'm going to catch it in my tray down there. And I need to remove two long bolts from the back of the oil pan. These long bolts actually go all the way from the bottom of the pan and grab onto the bottom of the rear cover. They're 10 millimeters. Okay, I'm going to remove those two. And since I've removed all the other rear cover bolts, this cover is ready to come off. So find a spot to pry it off. Ooh, that is disgusting. Like this one didn't just sit out in the rain. It sat in a monsoon. Looks like we might still have quite a bit of oil still left in this engine. I'm going to rotate it back up before I lose too much. There we go. So I'm going to use a bucket to capture the oil that's inside this engine, hopefully. Of course, the drain pan is not in the best spot. All right, welcome back. As much of the oil that would drain out is actually drained out, and we're going to go ahead and remove the oil pan. We're going to do the oil pan first because the crankshaft dampener bolt is very tight and I need a way to lock the crankshaft. And a very convenient way of doing that is actually having the oil pan off and getting access to the crankshaft from the bottom. So to remove this oil pan, it would be really nice if I could just roll this engine over entirely, and I could do that, but what I'm trying to do is prevent a lot of mess, and I also want to keep what's in the pan in it so that we can observe it in the video. So this is just going to be a series of 10mm bolts that are going to go around the perimeter of the pan. Now if it seems like you have all the bolts out and the pan's not coming off, guess what? It's not off. Okay, so we need to make sure that we get every single bolt out of this thing. And I'm just going to set the bolts down here in the bottom of the pan, in the drain pan here. Now, it's good to get all but a few bolts because you want to make sure that you don't just drop this pan all the way down to the floor. This is also something that you're probably going to have to do in the vehicle. So I left one on that side, and it's still in there. And I'm over here and I'm taking all these out. Now I do have to take a bracket off of the side so I can access one of the bolts. Okay, so I've gotten all but one bolt. I noticed the pan has just gotten loose. So from this side, I'm going to hold up on this pan, removing the last bolt, and then jiggling this pan down. Oops, got me in the face there. And then we're going to drop this pan down to the catch tray. So again, this one actually has the factory gasket, and we'll see why in a second, or how I can tell. Let's bring it up to the table. Okay. All right, so here we are at the table, and we see that we do have a considerable amount of varnish buildup in the pan. The way that I can tell that this pan is actually the original one is that this gasket is installed at the factory that manufactures the oil pan, because they rivet the gasket on there at that factory. So if we look down the bottom, I don't know if you can see it, but I can see quite a bit of chunks bouncing back and forth, but I don't think I see any major pieces, say like bearing pieces. I think this is all just high mileage junk and you know, not major damage to the engine. So we'll set this over here and keep going with the disassembly. So this time, because the pan's off and that's where a lot of that junk was, we're going to go ahead and roll this engine over. Probably going to have stuff fall out, things pour out. There we go, we got some water. Now because this engine was being stored upside down, it's got water in the cylinders, which shouldn't be that big of a deal because we're going to be rebuilding it. So let me grab my impact. I'm just going to leave those bolts down there. Now we need to remove the pickup tube and the windage tray. I'm going to start by removing the pickup tube, retaining nut, and then we have one 10mm bolt holding on the tube to the pump down here in the front. There we go. So we can go back to removing all the nuts. So when we remove this pickup tube, we want to do a couple things. Oh, I forgot one nut on it. So when we remove this tube, we want to notice a couple things about it. We pull it off, the first thing we want to look at is the O-ring on the front of the tube that goes down into the pump. Oh, this one's actually broken. So this oil pickup tube O-ring is broken. So we can see I didn't do anything. I just pulled on that thing and it just split. So there's a good chance that this engine could have had low oil pressure while it was running. The other thing we want to look at is down inside the screen here. Now we'll talk more about this, but down inside this is kind of like a pre-filter for the engine oil pump and the filter and the bearings for the engine. If any large pieces of gasket or large pieces of bearing material or pieces off of the timing chain get down to the pan, they'll actually get stuck up into that pickup tube. And you can see what it is and try to determine what's wrong with this engine before you go too much further. So from here, we're moving off the nuts for the windage tray. There we go. So what the windage tray does is it helps to reduce the turbulence in the bottom of the pan. So the last thing they want is to have excess resistance against the crankshaft spinning. So when this engine is spinning, oil actually makes it down to the bottom of the windage tray and it splashes into the oil that's sitting in the pan, but it doesn't splash back up onto the crankshaft. And because it doesn't splash back up on the crank, it actually sheds the oil from the crankshaft, which makes it lighter and also, you know, a little bit more efficient. So we can see this is our windage tray. So it's got these little louvers right here, and those louvers are where the oil shoots out from the crankshaft spinning, and it's going to spin in this direction across the bottom. The oil comes out, it splashes, but it can't get back up to the crankshaft. It also has another set of louvers over here too for the same purpose. You see that it's pretty varnished up. So the next thing that I want to do is try and determine how I can hold this crankshaft still. Now I'm not going to be pushing the crankshaft down or holding it down by just shoving something in any of these holes. Sorry about all the grunts there and trying to get this pin lined up. Use some leverage. There we go, that might do it. So I just need this thing locked. So that I can put some torque against the crankshaft bolt. Now I see that I've got a deep hole here on the crankshaft, and that's a balancing hole, and we'll get to see more of those later. But I'm pretty sure that I can stick a 3/8 extension down inside this hole, rotate the crankshaft till the extension hits the side of the block, and then I can break that bolt loose, hopefully. Just depends on how tight it is. So if I take this, I put my, oh no, that one's not going to fit. So give me a minute. Let's see if this bolt will fit down in there. That should do it. Let's just see how well it does it. So, ooh, that's water being pumped out of the cylinders. Let's see if this bolt holds it. Yeah, it did just fine. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the crankshaft bolts. Now, to remove the dampener, it's not just pull this thing off. It's actually pressed onto the crankshaft snout. So there's an interference fit between the end of the crankshaft and the inside of the dampener. So it's the hole that the crankshaft goes into is smaller than the hole on, or sorry, it's larger than the hole on the harmonic balancer. So we actually have to pull this thing off with a tool. Now the traditional tool would be one of these. So we're going to save that O-ring. The traditional tool is a crankshaft dampener remover, and this has actually got multiple purposes. You can actually use these on old steering wheels and stuff to pull the steering wheel off of the steering column. But this one requires threaded holes in the front of the dampener, and this engine and many engines don't have that. So what's out there is a special toolkit, which you can buy pretty cheaply. I got this one on Amazon. It ended up being the cheapest one I could get, and it actually works really well.
So it's got a forcing screw, and that goes down into this yoke. Now this yoke has these little arms, and these arms have hooks. They're actually going to grab onto the front of the crankshaft, onto the spokes, and then we have these 4 push rods, and these push rods are going to slide down into the forcing screw, and they're going to force against the end of the hole where the crankshaft bolt goes. So let's see which forcing screw we need. Because I don't remember. I think we're going to need this one. Let's give that a shot. So it's kind of cumbersome to put it in there, but once it gets in there and you have it tightened, it'll be ready to go. So I'm going to get this in, going to hook it, and I'll show you more of this once we get everything apart and we start doing parts identification. So I'm going to run that down. Now the nice thing about this one is that actually the end of the forcing screw, not only is it a 19 millimeter, but it has a 3/8 hole broached in the end of it, so you can just stick your impact in the end of this and force the screw down. So that's what I'm going to do right now. It looks like I'm going to need the long forcing screw. So let me take out this that one there and put in the longer rod. I'm going to flip it over. Slide this all the way down the end of the crankshaft. And Bob's your uncle, it comes right off. So with a close-up shot, let's see what's going on here on our table. So the bolt screws into the end of the crankshaft. Well, that bolt hole has a bottom. That's what this rod is going to push against. It's actually pushing in the end of the crankshaft. And what's happening on the other end is that these little arms are actually grabbing onto these steps that are cast into the dampener. And this is just, the reason they do this is it's very cheap, and because they're removing a machining process, the cost to manufacture this component is considerably less. So the next thing that we're going to be doing is removing the front cover and exposing the timing chain and assembly. So I need to push back on my lock bolt here. Let me just pry that up just to loosen it up some. This is an extra bolt. Let's not mix these up. And then we're going to take the impact and the 10 millimeter socket. Get my 10 out. And we're going to remove all the bolts that go into the front cover. There you go. Here. Now we're going to pry on the back side of the cover and just pop it loose. And there we have our front covers removed. The gasket stayed in place. So we're going to go ahead and get it out of the way because it's good to just pull all the trash off so we can throw it away now. We also get to look at it. Okay. So this gasket here is a one-piece embossed gasket. And normally this gasket material, this rubber material, is actually made into, or it's actually impregnated or molded into this aluminum frame. But this one here is just so old, it's just coming loose. And definitely this would have been replaced anyway, so it's not a big deal. So, the inside of our front cover, this thing is dirty. We have a varnish buildup, and this engine could have been very well taken care of. They might have changed their oil every 5,000 miles, or they might not have taken very good care of it. But it did have a lot of miles on this engine, supposedly over 200,000, and for that, we really don't have that much wrong. The last thing I want to remove off of this engine is going to be the oil pump. See, this oil pump is concentric with the crankshaft, so the crankshaft is going to drive this oil pump directly. What holds the oil pump on are just 4 10mm bolts that bolt it to the front of the block. So, when I remove this, on the front of the crankshaft is actually a drive flange, and this drive flange is a toothed gear. Well, I guess I don't know necessarily, it's a spline, and those splines are actually going to lock into splines that are on the inside of the pump. And the inside of this pump, you should be able to see it inside here. See these little notches? I'm going to pull it with the gear to the side. Those notches are actually what line up with the spline on the crankshaft, and that's what's driving it. Now notice what's coming out of it. We got a clear liquid and we got some gooey liquid. Clear liquid's water. The gooey stuff is probably water and oil. Hopefully my head wasn't in the way. You know what? Let's take it one step further, and we're going to remove the timing gear and the timing chain. First thing I do before I take this guy off is I'm going to see how much slack is in this chain, and we see that it's moving probably maybe 3/8 to, probably about 3/8 of an inch. Okay, that's not too bad. This is actually a pretty good chain still. We're not going to reuse it, but that's just the way it is. But now when I remove this, it's probably not the best way to do it because we're here. I'm going to do it because all of our valve train is actually spring loaded right now. So we might hear some valves opening and closing. We got all of our bolts out. And then we're just going to pry this timing gear off of the camshaft. Oh, it looks like it's in a neutral position. Just need to get this guy, walk it off. And then we lift it up and take the chain off the crankshaft, and there we have our timing chain. There's our timing chain right there. And timing gear. So this part right here, these 3 bolts are actually going to bolt to the camshaft, and the camshaft is still in the block. And that will be left for another time. So the next step that we're going to do in the next video is we're going to be removing the cylinder heads, inspecting the gaskets, inspecting the valve train. So there's going to be a few steps in there. Should be a shorter video. And then the last video is going to be removing and inspecting. Actually, no, wait, so not the last video. The next video after the cylinder head is going to be removing the pistons and inspecting the pistons and the connecting rods and their bearings. And then the final video will be removing the crankshaft and inspecting it. So once we get done with the crankshaft, this block will be empty. We'll do anything else that will be required for disassembly, and we'll get it ready for cleaning, inspection, and machining. So until then, I'll see you later.